Welcome to the second of our lectures on colonial Protestant missions in 16th, 17th, and 18th century. And in this lecture, I expect that the student will describe the various avenues by which Christianity came to Africa in the 16th century, especially through the Portuguese. The student will explore the methods and motivations for Portuguese colonial Christianity. And the student will evaluate the effectiveness of Portuguese Christianity in Africa. So before we get into the specifics of when missions took root in which areas, let's talk a little bit about what colonialism is and how it developed. If I'm to give the most general unscientific definition of colonialism, it's the process by which one people extends its rule and control over another people. And colonialism or colonization can include economic, political, military, and religious transplantation from the mother country to the colony. Colonialism was often an extension of mercantilism by using the colony for raw materials or locking the country into an exclusive trade deal. So the opposite of free trade. The colony existed for the economic benefit of the mother country, right? This is what gave rise to what we study in high school as the triangular trade, which some historians have claimed that the triangular trade turned the Atlantic Ocean into an African lake, that slaves are going one direction, raw materials were going another, and goods were going in yet another direction. European goods were taken from Portugal to Africa, slaves were taken from Africa to the New World, and raw materials were taken to Europe to produce the finished goods, right? Philip Hoffman estimated that by the year 1800, 35% of the world was under European control. But by 1914, that had risen to 84%. So in 115 years or so, the world became 50% more controlled by Europe. In the early 16th century, the political and religious turmoil caused by the Reformation distracted most of the continent. So while Germany was busy Germany and its surrounding nations, busy trying to sort their religion, there were other powers that were expanding. Russia, 13 to 1500, expanded east into the Urals, 1500 to 1800 west into Central Europe, 1700 to 1800 north into the Baltics but not Scandinavia, and from 1800 to 1900 into Central Asia and the Caucasus. The Dutch was the imperial power that kind of took over when Spain and Portugal faltered. And they controlled small parts of South Africa, Malaysia, North America, New Amsterdam, which became New York, and the east coast of South America. The Dutch did not establish a significant foothold before its wars kind of distracted them from colonial expansion. The British is the Protestant empire we are most familiar with, but that did not start until the 18th century. We talk about the first British Empire from 1707 to 1783, when it expanded into Canada and the colonies. In the 18th century, Britain was entangled in a series of European wars that prevented their colonial expansion. War of the Spanish Succession, War of Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War. And the first British Empire came to a close at Yorktown when America threw off their British control. So beginning in 1783, Britain began what we call the Second British Empire. And because Britain's expansion westward was halted by the Americans, they started to expand eastward into Australia and New Zealand. In the 19th century, they expanded into India and Africa. And that change in direction was because of the American Revolution. French expanded into Canada, into North Africa, West Africa, and Napoleonic France expanded in whatever direction it could, right? But when we talk about the 15th, 16th century European colonizers, we're talking about Spain and Portugal. So I have a theory that the more entangled the country was in the Reformation, the less available they were for colonial expansion. This is why the first wave of colonial expansion was Catholic, because they were not directly entangled in the Protestant Reformation. They had an established a religion that allowed the Jesuits to form and get to every corner of the earth before the Protestants could even agree on a confession. Right? Britain only successfully colonized after their Reformation was somewhat settled. Another factor we should talk about in the rise of colonial Christianity in Africa was the role of Islam. When Islam swept across North Africa and Persia, it severed all southern and eastern land routes from Europe to Asia, Europe to Central Africa. The problem was Europe had already developed a taste for certain spices, certain goods, but with no land access, Europe had to find alternate routes. Initially, Europe instigated a crusade to militarily overthrow Islam to regain these avenues of access, but that did not work out very well for the Europeans or the people in the Middle East. It was a disaster. They had to find different avenues. In addition to the Crusades, there was the Reconquista. The Islamic Umayyad dynasty reached into Iberia, into Spain, and beginning in the 8th century, Christian Spain fought back, but the Reconquista was not complete until 1492, right? So Christianity had sought to evangelize Muslims. That wasn't going anywhere. They tried to conquer Muslims and kind of open up those channels. They at least were able to get rid of the Muslims from Central Europe. But when we think about the age of exploration, it was not primarily an attempt to expand a colonial empire, but to overcome the barriers that Islam had created in free trade. So let's discuss how the Portuguese and the Spanish brought Christian Catholicism into West Africa, East Africa, and Asia. And as we have talked about, their purpose in doing so is to circumvent the Islamic Empire, to find a sea route to continue to trade the goods that they wanted to spend money on. There was a religious motivation. There was a myth of sorts in 15th, 16th century Europe of an African Christian king known as Prester John. And if European Christians could make contact with this distant, isolated Christian king, they could incite him to attack Islam and open up a two-front war to squeeze Islam out of the way. Right? Another purpose in colonial expansion was economic, to find gold. They knew that there was gold to be found in Africa because the Malian king Mansa Musa was so wealthy, he sent 500 slaves to Hajj in preparation for his Islamic pilgrimage. As Mansa Musa was going on Hajj, he came through Egypt and bestowed so much gold and gifts in Egypt, it lowered the value of gold in Egypt. So rumors of this wealth drove the Portuguese to secure their economic future in Africa. Let me offer you a quote here. The slave trade was not the main reason that the Portuguese set out to explore the coast of Africa. Within a few decades, however, driven in no small part by the explosive demand for agricultural labor to work the plantations of America, and by the enormous profits that could be accumulated when the labor was forced, that is, provided by enslaved people, the slave trade soon overtook everything else in the Portuguese economy in West Africa. In other words, the Portuguese had gone into West Africa hoping to find piles of gold waiting for them to just take them away, and they didn't find that. Their economic venture looked for other ways that they could economically capitalize on this colonial expansion. And the slave trade became that, but that was not the original motivation. The first major figure that we talk about in Portuguese expansion is Henry the Navigator. He was born at the end of the 14th century, 1394, lived to about 1460. Prince Henry participated in a small-scale crusade on Ceuta in Morocco, and the Pope named him Grand Master of the Military Order of Christ and commissioned him to bring the gospel along with his expeditions. And ever since, Christianity followed Portuguese imperial expansion. In the 15th and 16th century, the Portuguese made their way down the coast of West Africa. Exploration began on the outer islands like the Canary Islands and San Tome. And Prince Henry the Navigator himself had reached the Gold Coast by 1460. That's Ghana today. By 1488, the Portuguese and Bartholomew Diaz had worked their way down around the Cape of Good Hope onto the east coast of Africa. By 1498, Vasco da Gama reached Mozambique, which eventually became the second largest Portuguese colony next to Brazil, I believe. And da Gama continued to secure trading posts up East Africa into Asia to India. By 1500, the Portuguese Pedro Alves Cabral had encountered, had accumulated Brazil without Spanish objection before continuing on to the east coast of Africa, Mozambique, and then southwest India. Alfonso de Albuquerque established a trading monopoly along the east coast of Africa, the Swahili coast, and then on to India and Asia. So the centralized Portuguese government provided singular control over these brand new shipping lanes that went down the west coast of Africa, up the east coast of Africa, to India, and then eventually China. And by 1513, Portugal had reached China. And they had set up trade with mainland China. By 1519, we have Ferdinand Magellan, who departed from Seville with 5 ships in the fleet. He sailed to Tierra del Fuego, what is now called the Straits of Magellan. So he got to the Pacific Ocean by going around South America. And he arrived in the Philippines, died around the Philippines. Tragically, in 1522, only one of Magellan's ships made it home. So while it was a monumental task that he circumnavigated the globe, it came at a price. Right? 1492, Spain funded Christopher Columbus's journey to the Americas. In 1494, the Pope issued a papal bull, Inter Caetera, that established the division of colonial holdings. Spain got the west of the Atlantic without Brazil, and Portugal received the east of the Atlantic. So the Pope kind of divided the Atlantic in half and gave North and South America to the Spanish, gave Africa to the Portuguese, to not divide Catholic interests in their expansion. Now that we've seen the overview of how Catholic Spain and Portugal moved into Africa, Asia, and the Americas, I want to tell some of the individual stories of how it geographically made its way down the West African coast, up the East African coast, into Asia. Not because I think you need to know the individual stories, but I want you to understand the big story. So these are illustrations of a bigger story. So when Portugal first came into the African lands, they started with the islands, the Canary Islands, San Tome, and they made landfall, so to speak, in an area where the Wolof people lived. Interestingly, as I'm giving this lecture, I have a missions team from my church that is currently in Senegal working with the Wolof people. The Wolof people occupied a territory that covers what is today Senegal and Gambia. They were originally a vassal state of the Kingdom of Mali. But when Mali had a dynastic dispute, Senegambia took that opportunity to break off from their service to Mali. But they had some internal dissension as to who to lead, how to lead. And as the story goes, an Arab leader from Mecca arrived and settled a local dispute. And as a result, the Wolof people made this Islamic Arab their leader. So when the Portuguese came trading, the Wolof moved their capital from an inland city to Dakar, which is on the coast, which allowed for a lot freer trade. You know what? Most of the Wolof people did not appreciate A, moving the capital, B, Wolof leaders cozying up to these white Europeans, so they eventually killed their king. And the son of the king, a man named Prince Bemoy, thought his life was in danger, so he went to the Portuguese for protection, was taken to Portugal, converted to Christianity, was baptized, and the Portuguese were bringing him back to the Wolof people to install him as not just a king, but a king who would trade on friendly terms with the Portuguese. But during the trip back to Senegambia, Prince Bemoy was very stubborn, and the Portuguese killed him. I think we saw that one coming, right? Portuguese moved down the west coast of Africa into Sierra Leone. And in 1606, Balthazar Barea, a Jesuit, converted the Bullum ruler and baptized this ruler as Philip Leonis. And this was a very effective Catholic mission. Thousands were baptized under the Capuchin mission. But when the Capuchins left, it left this Christian vacuum there that would not be filled until the 18th century. So Christianity did actually take hold quickly, widespread in Sierra Leone, and then it just disappeared for about 100 years. Portuguese moved into what we call the Gold Coast, Ghana. In 1482, the Portuguese built a fort at Elmina, the mine, to protect gold mining interests there. And the Portuguese did seek to partner with the Ghanaians by building this fort to protect Portuguese interests and to protect Ghana from their enemies, the shaman. Unfortunately, in building this military fort that was to protect locals, they unwittingly destroyed some sacred rocks, which severed the alliance right then and there. So the Portuguese were never able to effectively partner with the locals there. Portugal moved further west down the African coast, West African coast, to what we call now the Slave Coast, Togo and Benin. In the kingdom of Benin, the Portuguese established a trade city of Wida. And in 1515, the first missionaries came. And these missionaries learned of a distant kingdom called Ogani, who held, quote, in as great a veneration as is the supreme pontiff with us. In other words, they thought they had found a roadmap to Prester John, this lost, isolated Christian kingdom in Central Africa. The king of Benin welcomes the missionaries and sent his son back to Portugal to be baptized and learn to read, but the son had died before he could assume his father's throne. And it started with a small number of Bini Christians. This mission started as a small number of Bini Christians in Nigeria. And Alfonso Ames, Portuguese missionary, came and established schools, Christian schools in Nigeria. The Benin people thought themselves as slaves to the king. So when these missionaries tried to convert the locals would say, no, we can't convert to Christianity until our king converts to Christianity. That will allow us to convert. And that's an interesting reversal of sorts, because a lot of times Christians came in and converted the king who forced their people to, but it seems like in some areas of the world there was such a connection between the people and the king that not only would they convert if their king did, as if it was some sort of political move. No, they saw a real attachment there. And we can discuss that in class. How real is that attachment, right? Let's see. The Portuguese moved into the Niger River Delta in the Kingdom of Wari. And these were neighbors to the Kingdom of Benin. Kingdom of Wari was founded shortly before the coming of the Portuguese. And in the 1570s, Christianity begins among the Wari through Augustinian monks from San Tome. There was some initial responsiveness, but the Augustinians were not able to send enough clergy to support a broader effort. Two Capuchins had come, and they had raised their own funds by making pottery and selling it to the locals, right? Let's see. By the time of 1620, Christianity had taken root in the Kingdom of Wari to the extent that it was considered a Christian kingdom. So let me read you a quote. Outside the town of Santo Agostino, there are no other Christians, and even in the town, only a minority are in the Catholic faith. Although very many of them are nominally Christian, true Christianity is almost wholly confined to the king and the prince. The rest only call themselves Christian in order to please the king. So what we see in the Kingdom of Benin, this real connection between the people and their king, we see right next door in the Kingdom of Wari that connection was not the same. That Wari was considered a Christian kingdom, but outside the capital, named St. Augustine, there were no Christians, and even inside the capital there were few Christians. So Catholicism continued to be the religion of the elites in Wari until the 18th century, when a local King Ola restored traditional African religion there. And by 1840, an English observer had noted that the church and the chapels had all been overgrown and abandoned. Traveling further south down the coast of West Africa, is the Kingdom of Congo. In AD 1483, Portuguese arrived at the mouth of the Congo River and exchanged emissaries, taking two back to Portugal. Right? 1491, Portuguese returned to Congo with several Franciscan monks to establish a mission. Also in 1491, King Nzinga Nkuwu renamed, man, this is weird. I think I'm better on the African pronunciation than the Portuguese. João the First, Joao. Apologies to my Brazilian friends. King Nzinga Nkuwu was baptized, and his son was baptized as Alfonso. And after several years, King Nkuwu returned to the traditional faith. So Christianity in the Congo was less a personal religion as it was a diplomatic posture, a way to establish a connection with the Portuguese. But foreigners always considered Congo a Christian state. Alfonso, the king's son, became king after a civil war and had no traditional right to the throne. So he reached out to the Portuguese Christians to support his claim to the throne. So Alfonso destroyed the traditional temples and built a Christian church in its place, Salvador, our Savior. And there was something of a congruence between the Christian and Congolese worldview. They both thought that the supernatural world was real, that the supernatural world broke into the natural world, and they looked for significance in dreams and natural phenomena. Because Alfonso established this connection with Portugal, the goods that were brought into the Congo through Portugal gave credibility to King Alfonso's rule, increased their patronage. Right? Alfonso's son, Henrique, returned as Bishop of North Africa, only to be marginalized in the Congo. And the next African bishop would not be till 1970 in the Congo. When Congo lost the Battle of Mbuila, it never really recovered. So it failed to benefit from their relationship to Catholic Christianity. Therefore, Christianity started to decline. It did survive, though, as a lay-led movement there, which is interesting. Angola, further down the western coast of Africa. Diogo Cao reached this area in 1484. In 1575, King Álvaro I from the Congo allowed Portugal to establish a small settlement called Luanda south of their lands, which became Angola. So this was Angola was originally on the outskirts of the Congo, and it was through mission that it became its own place. The Portuguese tended to just settle the coast because their primary interest was military forts and the acquisition of gold. So they did not settle into the interior. Eventually, the Catholic Jesuits came to replace the military order of Christ in the region, and rather than military control, the Jesuits bought land under the leadership of Pero Tavares and started educating the Angolans. And this Christian Angola lasted until the mid-17th century. But it remained a source for the slave trade until its independence in 1820. So we've seen how Portuguese and Spanish Christianity worked its way geographically down the west coast. Let's talk about how it worked up the east coast. When Spain and Portugal worked their way down the west coast, they eventually came around what we know as South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, started to work their way north up the eastern coast. And this began in Zambezi, Mozambique. The first settlements were in 1505 and 1508. And from Mozambique, they had access to the mouth of the Zambezi River, which proved to be something of a superhighway into the interior of Africa. Excuse me. In 1560, a Jesuit missionary, Goncalo de Silveira, came from southern India to travel up the Zambezi River into the kingdom of Mwene Mutapa. And the king Chizamhura Ngomo welcomed the Portuguese Jesuit because the Jesuit didn't come to trade slaves. We see already, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, that the slave trade was a significant obstacle to Christianity, and unsurprisingly. The king had claimed visions of the Virgin Mary and was baptized less than a year after De Silva's arrival. Less than 2 months later, a Muslim trader convinced the king that the Jesuit was a Portuguese spy, and the king had the Jesuit missionary strangled in his sleep. Next comes Zimbabwe. And in Zimbabwe, a Dominican community emerged, supported by a Javanese woman, Violante. That sentence is a remarkable sentence. That a European Dominican community was founded in Southeast Africa, supported by a Javanese woman, is a sentence that probably could not be used in the centuries prior to the 14th, 15th century, right? This mission baptized hundreds of people, but they did not educate them. They were not able to instruct them properly. We do have records that in 1591, 20,000 were baptized. So this is a significant Catholic community. Traveling north up the Swahili coast, they came to the city of Kilwa. And the Portuguese undermined the trade that made the Swahili coast profitable. So that's why most of our discussion revolves around the west coast of Africa. The east coast of Africa was further away. It had taken more genuinely to Christianity, and it simply just wasn't as profitable. So let's talk a little bit about slavery and missions and how the two related to each other. In AD 1441, the first expedition returned to Portugal with slaves, very early in this colonial expansion. In 1444, 235 captives were brought back. We did state that the initial motivation for expanding into West Africa was not to trade slaves, and that is 100% true. However, when they got to the west coast of Africa, they did not find the gold sitting around like they had hoped. and they discovered the profitability of slaves. And that motive began to eclipse all other motives. And initially, there were several rationales that supported slavery. First was a military rationale. Portuguese Christians were moving into a largely Islamic Africa. And since the Crusades, the European Christians saw themselves locked in this eternal battle with the Muslim world, so they thought it was their right to take military prisoners whenever they came across a Muslim. So they had a military rationale for this. Second, there was an evangelistic rationale. The papacy had promoted the conversion of Muslims and pagans in Africa. Converted Africans began to organize themselves in Ladinos for mutual support. And the Pope repeatedly called on Portugal specifically to evangelize the people they encountered. But this was not the central characteristic of Portugal's imperial vehicle, right? In AD 1457, Diogo Gomes traveled to Mali to debate the Muslim leader, claiming that he had converted the Mandinka, the leader, Nomi Mansa. Papal bulls such as Inter Caetera stated that slaves are to be evangelized. And despite this papal promotion of evangelism, there was one major obstacle to local people embracing Christianity, as they saw with their own eyes Catholic missionaries getting off the same boats that took slaves back, right? The role Christianity played in propping up the slave trade challenged the very identity of Christianity, and therefore challenged its effectiveness in Africa. Third, there was a political rationale for taking slaves. Christian theologian Isidore of Seville compiled a work known as the Etymologies. That was his attempt to create something like the Encyclopedia Britannica, a compendium of all Christian knowledge. And he argued that while all men are born free under the law of nature, slavery has to exist according to the law of nations. So there was some political theory out there that gave a rationale for slavery. And fourth, we come to the racial rationale. It is 100% true that Europeans initially did not see their hierarchy in terms of race. White good, everyone else not as good, or sometimes subhuman. Originally, that structure was civilized versus heathen. But eventually, heathen began to be associated with a race. And we can pinpoint this conversion as well. Because originally, slaves that were taken were considered indentured servants and manumitted after a number of years. This proved to be bad for business because you spend a lot of money getting that indentured servant. You can't just let him go without a return on your investment, right? So the law was changed in Europe to allow Europeans to take slaves. So the original law was you were allowed to enslave non-Christian people for the purpose of evangelism, right? And then they had to be manumitted when they were baptized or after a certain number of years. This was bad for business. So at a certain point, they had the law changed. Not that it was acceptable to enslave non-Christians, but acceptable to or legal to enslave non-Europeans. And that's where we see this transition from hierarchies being thought of in cultural terms, civilized versus heathens, to introducing this racial component to us. Prior to the 15th century, slaves were allowed to purchase their freedom. They were allowed to earn their freedom through conversion or through periods of service. But that was what was cut off. Eventually, the Portuguese learned to rely less on captives and began to trade European goods for humans, which rulers from neighboring goods would take, right? The Portuguese realized it was bad for business to show up in Africa and forcibly take people. So instead what they did is they put local African leaders in a position where they would take people, usually neighboring enemies, and then sell them to the Portuguese. That was more cost effective. That led to better relations with some of the people in Africa, right? Between 1500 and 1850, an estimated 10 to 15 million African slaves came to the New World. 10 to 15% of those died in passage, and another 10 to 15% of those died of disease in the New World. The other business problem that Europeans had is that this death rate far exceeded the birth rate. So they continually had to go back and take more slaves to sustain their economy. So we can see that Christianity had a troubling and problematic relationship with the slave trade. I think it's unfair, as a lot of secular historians try and do, to equate the two, as if Christianity were nothing but a white supremacist movement. But if you remember our framework for our course, Hebrews 13:7, remember those who spoke the word of God to you, consider their way of life and imitate their faith. We have a responsibility to approach Christians, even Christians of different persuasions than us, critically. And the ways in which they reflect God's word, well, let's embrace that. And the ways in which they didn't, let's reject that. So I hope no one takes these types of lectures as a wholesale endorsement of any racial theory or any Christian practice in centuries gone by. We do need the facts in order to consider well. So I appreciate your time and patience. Thank you.